This is the Byzantine Empire from 333 to 1453 AD. This is by Julissa, Erica, John, Connor, and Megan. So for the location of the Byzantine Empire, it expanded across Eurasia, touching parts of North Africa and including present-day countries like Spain, Italy, Syria, and encompassing the entire Mediterranean Sea. Over several hundred years, however, the culture did shrink to only a part of Bulgaria and Macedonia, as you'll see in the next slide. With its capital on a strait, it has a pretty unique location for Constantinople because it made it less vulnerable to external threats. And one important factor about the location of the Byzantine Empire is that during its peak time, it contained parts of the largest river in the world, the Nile in Egypt, and the Euphrates River. So this picture in the top left shows the progression of how large the empire was. So that red line on the outside is how big it was at the peak. So you can see it encompassed the Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates in Syria. And then the light red is when it shrunk down the first time, and then that dark red is where it's kind of how big it was towards the end of its rule. The picture on the right is the flag of the Byzantine Empire, and the bottom left is Constantinople, a very luxurious and rich city at its peak. So for brief history, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the western half ceased to exist while the eastern half continued as the Byzantine Empire. The capital city, Constantinople, was one of the richest, most luxurious, and significant city for Christians. So this had a lot of importance at the time in Europe. Justinian I was the Byzantine Empire's strongest ruler and made that initial conquering of the entire Mediterranean Sea, encompassing Egypt and parts of Syria. And it experienced a golden age between 867 and 1025 AD, with expanding military and religious influence over Arabs and the Slavs in Russia. However, the Byzantines were eventually triumphed over by the Ottoman Empire after they took Constantinople in May of 1453. After the Ottomans besieged the city for 55 days, the Byzantines surrendered. And this is of great significance because it allowed the Ottomans to continue and expand into Eastern Europe.
So if you look at both photos here on the right, and if you try to tell which one's California and which one's Italy, they look, and that's because both the environments are Mediterranean. Much of the land that was used in the Byzantine Empire was used for agriculture and livestock, but it changed throughout ruler and culture. The fertile soil that the Mediterranean climate provided gave easy access to the sea, and also led to the rise of agriculture and trade. The Byzantine Empire harbored a lot of really easy resources. They had olive oil, wine, fish, wheat, and honey. These natural resources were commonly traded throughout the Mediterranean. They had a lot of ports all around the sea, and they made a lot of revenue through trading in between their empire. The resources were also traded with the Far East, China, and India for spices, incense, and silk, which were luxurious goods for the Byzantine Empire. Cattle, sheep, pigs, timber, and metal were also traded around the empire, but not as of utmost significance as olive oil, wine, fish, wheat, and honey.
So there were two major groups of citizens in this social system the Byzantine Empire had. The first one being the honestiores, which included the rich and privileged people like senators, equestrians, decurions, who were military officers, and veterans. And then a step down from this, there was the humiliores, which was basically everyone else who has to work for a living, like lawyers, accountants, merchants, farmers, etc. And within this category, there were some different levels of higher ranking, but not significant enough to be a different citizen class. And then finally, there were lots of slaves in the empire, and they were not considered citizens, so were not considered part of the social system per se, but they were below even the poorest of the working class, and were taken from conquered countries, were taken as prisoners of war, and purchased from slave markets. And the relationship of the Byzantine Empire with its neighbors was different depending on how the neighbors responded to them conquering them. They found it easy to conquer a lot of the neighbors because those countries didn't have a formal legal structure set up like the empire did. And because it spread so massively, it was greatly influenced by Latin, Armenian, and Persian cultures. And their foreign policy was heavily influenced by its Orthodox Christian beliefs. And one article describes the ultimate rationale of the Byzantine Empire's existence was its Christian imperial mission. So this affected a lot of its foreign relations with its neighbors.
There were a couple of events which led to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. However, many of the events were a result of the government's lack of unity, structure, and support. In 540 AD, a plague wiped out much of the population and struggled to withstand military during these events. And in 643 AD, Muslim Arabs raided South Palestine and defeated Byzantine as a result of a series of battles. And then Palestine and Egypt were lost and caused a huge disparity as Egypt was vital for its commodities and natural resources. In 1025 AD, governors increased taxes on peasants to support military. This failed badly because peasants could no longer afford paying, and overall, the military weakened from this. Now, fast forward to the 1000s era, there were multiple revolts, civil wars, and poor administration decisions, which soon became the worst administration in the history of the empire. Finally, in 1453 AD, the Ottomans successfully attacked and took over Constantinople. At that point on, Byzantine was never recovered.
So what happened to the people after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire? So after the collapse of Constantinople, the people of the Byzantine Empire came under the jurisdiction of the Ottomans since the Ottomans had defeated them. However, there was still Byzantine resistance in other regions of Europe. There was a stronghold in Athens, and that fell in 1458. And there was also a stronghold in 1460. It took about another 10 years for the Ottomans to fully spread through the Byzantine Empire and take out the remaining Byzantine resistance, including the last one, which was Trebenese, and that fell in 1461. Trebenese is actually unique in the fact that they survived so long by paying taxes to neighboring empires, including the Mongols. That's why they were able to survive and thrive for so long. And so the people were, many of the ruling families and rich families actually were able to integrate into Ottoman society. And the Ottoman Empire was ruled by the sultans, which are a group of Islamic leaders. So there was a lot of Islamic influence on the Byzantine Empire. And as a result, Islam grew in that region. However, the Islamic leaders, the sultans, were very tolerant of the Orthodox Christians, and there was a lot of respect between the Orthodox Christians and the Muslims in the old area of the Byzantine Empire. And as a result, some of the culture of the Byzantine Empire continued to thrive in the Orthodox Church. And that could even be, you can even see it today through a lot of the art and a lot of the pieces of the Orthodox Christian Church. You can see a lot of the remaining culture of the Byzantine Empire, since the Orthodox Christian Church played such an important role in the Byzantine Empire, like Erica mentioned earlier. Thank you for watching our presentation.